Good morning. I hope that you had a great evening and you're ready for another read aloud. Okay, this one's for Miss Matthews' class. We are starting with chapter 10 today. Luke put off returning to school as long as possible. His stomach growled and he ignored it. The angle of the sun's rays grew sharper and sharper, but he consoled himself. Consoled is like he made himself feel better somehow. It's still daylight. It just starts looking like twilight sooner when you're deep in the woods. Finally, he could ignore the truth no longer. It was getting dark, and even if nobody had noticed his absence so far, he'd be missed at bedtime. Jackal Boy was sure to complain if Luke wasn't there for him to pick on. Strangely, that thought almost made him feel good. Luke didn't stop to figure that one out. He strode to the edge of the woods, looked around carefully, then took off running across the lawn. Halfway to the school, he was struck by a horrible thought. What if the door was locked? A few steps later, he was close enough to tell. The door wasn't open anymore. It wasn't even ajar. Remember, ajar means just a little open. Luke dashed even faster across the lawn as if he could outrun his panic. His heart pounded, and it wasn't just from running. He'd been so stupid going out the door in the first place. Or if he had to step outside, why hadn't he gone back right away? Why had he risked everything for a day in the woods? Well, he knew why. Luke was finally close enough to touch the doorknob. He reached out with a trembling hand, prepared for the worst. Stay calm, he told himself. If it's locked, maybe you can find another door that works. Maybe you can still slip back in undetected. Maybe, Luke didn't have much faith in maybes. Hopelessly, he twisted the knob. The knob turned easily. Barely daring to believe his luck, Luke pulled the door open a crack. He couldn't see anyone, so he slid in and let the door close behind him. It was dark at this end of the hall. He appreciated the shadows, which I think is really interesting because it's called Among the Imposters. And I think that these kids like to live in the shadows. They're shadow children. So he's gotten comfortable with that. Luke was tiptoeing past vacant classrooms when he heard the shout. Hey, what are you doing down here? It was one of the hall monitors. I got lost, Luke said, not stammering any more than he would have under normal circumstances. And the excuse was highly plausible. Hadn't he just been lost a million times so far at school? But he didn't know what he was missing. Supper, the evening lecture, lights out. The hall monitor peered at him suspiciously. Nobody's supposed to be in this wing of the building right now, he said. Why did you leave the dining hall? Luke got a sudden inspiration. I got sick, he said. I ran out to go to the bathroom. Then I got lost and I was going back. The hall monitor looked at him skeptically. The bathroom's right across from the dining hall, he said. I wasn't paying attention. I'm new. I'm sick. Luke tried to look dumb enough and queasy enough to have made such a stupid mistake. The hall monitor took a step back like he didn't want to catch anything. Okay, he relented. Go back immediately. Relieved, Luke turned to go. Then he stopped. Only the day before he would have obeyed unthinkingly. But now he had a secret to protect. Now he had to be crafty. He turned back to the monitor. I don't know how to get there from here. Oh, for crying out loud. Why do I have to babysit all the leckers? He took Luke's arm and jerked him to the right. Go that way. Turn left to the first hallway, then left and right again. Just get out of here. The hall monitor sounded a little panicked himself. The day before, Luke wouldn't have noticed, but now he had to pay attention. Something about that door, Luke thought. Why is the hall monitor so desperate to get me away from it? Luke was still pondering that question when he reached the doors to the dining hall. They burst open, and boys streamed out. Luke's timing was perfect. He'd gotten there just as everyone was heading toward the evening lecture. He blended in. See, Mr. Talbot, he thought bitterly, I'm following the only bit of advice you saw fit to give me. Aren't you proud? Mighty generous of you, I'm sure. It's being very sarcastic. But some of Luke's bitterness had eased. The note had been worthless, but he had the woods to think about now. And if the note had led him to the woods, well, he did have reason to be grateful to Jen's dad, didn't he? Nobody challenged Luke as he walked into the lecture room and sat down. Nobody asked, hey, where you been all day? Nobody ordered him, never leave the building again. He'd gotten away with it. He could get away with it again. Chapter 11. Luke longed to race straight to the woods as soon as he woke up the next morning. It was torture to stand patiently beside all the other boys, splashing water on his face. It was torture to sit still and slowly spoon in the lumpy oatmeal when he longed to gulp it down and get out of there. Though, since he'd missed 2 meals the day before, it was amazing how delicious the oatmeal seemed for once. It was torture waiting for the cafeteria doors to open and release everyone else to classes, and Luke to the woods. As soon as breakfast was over, he took off, all but running. Surprisingly, given how confused he usually got in the Hendricks halls, he managed to make a beeline straight for the door without once making a wrong turn and having to retrace his steps. Approaching the door, he slowed down, waiting for the crowd to clear in the hallway. Finally, there was only Luke and a hall monitor several yards away. The door wasn't open today, but Luke was confident that it wasn't locked. He was confident that he could slip out quickly enough. He glanced back. The monitor was looking the other way. Now, Luke reached for the doorknob, and then he drew back. At the last minute, it was like someone or something screamed, "No!" in his mind. Mother had talked about God sometimes. Maybe that's who it was. Or maybe it was Jen's spirit come to help Luke when her father's note hadn't. Maybe it was just as Luke's own common sense. Luke didn't know what he thought about God or ghosts or even his own intelligence, but he knew he couldn't risk going to the woods today. Have you ever had that before where you're about to do something and it's like, no, or do that? You have like a little, like, do that or don't do that, or maybe your conscience is just kind of speaking to you. That's what happened. Luke walked on, pretending to be casually dawdling. "Get to class," the monitor growled. Luke nodded and stepped into the classroom he passed. He felt as disappointed as if he'd discovered bars on the door. What was he, a coward? Luke remembered all the mind games he'd played with himself, trying to get up the nerve to go to Jen's house that first time. He'd waited weeks, always telling himself he was just waiting for the right moment. He had been a coward then. But he wasn't being a coward now. Sinking into a seat, as anonymous as every other boy in the room, he actually felt brave, clever, and crafty. Probably he'd just gotten lucky the day before. If he wanted to be able to go to the woods again and again and again without getting caught, he'd have to be smart about it. He'd have to pay attention to everything. Maybe he'd even have to figure out why the hall monitor the night before had been so panicky. Before he went back again, he'd have to know it was safe. Any ideas why the hall monitor is so panicky? Wonder why? I mean, I know why, but do you know why? Luke looked around the room. Up front, the teacher was drawing complicated-looking mathematical formulas on the chalkboard. Luke couldn't have solved any of them if his life depended on it. But for once, instead of sinking into despair and staring down at the desk in front of him, Luke got the nerve to peer around at the other boys. A few were watching the teacher. A few were taking notes. They were drawing pictures of girls. Some were blatantly sleeping, their mouths slack-jawed, and some were sitting off to the side, their arms clutched around their legs, rocking. Like they were like, Luke stared. He didn't have much to go on since he'd only known 6 people before in his entire life, but that rocking certainly didn't seem like normal behavior. Eventually, the bell rang, and he stumbled into another class. It was the same there, some boys acting normal, some boys rocking endlessly. Why hadn't he noticed anything like that before? Well, he knew why. Every other time he'd looked directly at any of the other boys, he'd glanced quickly, then looked away for fear that they might actually look back. You could miss a lot doing that. Walking through the hall to his next class, Luke tried an experiment. He stared directly into the eyes of every single boy who went past him. It was terrifying, even worse than running blindly across the lawn. Luke's stomach seized up, and he thought he might actually throw up the breakfast oatmeal. He thought his legs might crumple under him in fear. But it was so interesting. Most of the other boys he passed looked away as soon as Luke made eye contact. Some of them seemed to have a sort of sixth sense that warned them off from letting Luke look at them in the first place. Only 2 or 3 stared boldly back, their eyes locked on Luke's as Luke's were locked on theirs. Remember them. Luke ordered himself, but it took all his willpower just to keep himself from looking away. When he finally arrived in a classroom doorway, Luke was shaking all over. I gave something away just then, he thought. Now they're going to know. But he didn't know who they were. Woo! All right, we'll read chapter 12 tomorrow. Okay, let me know what you're thinking.